The fluorescent hum of the Midway Stop and Shop is a physical weight on my shoulders, a relentless, buzzing pressure that feels like it's trying to vibrate my teeth right out of my skull. It's 3:14 a.m., the dead hour where the world usually holds its breath, but tonight, the air feels jagged and wrong. I've worked this graveyard shift in the middle of the Indiana flatlands for 6 months, and I thought I'd seen every brand of midnight regular there was: the truckers with eyes like burnt-out embers, the twitchy college kids vibrating on caffeine, and the silent locals who buy their lottery tickets with hands that never stop shaking. But tonight, the silence outside isn't just quiet. It's an active, predatory void pressing against the glass, waiting for a structural failure in the light. Every time I look toward the windows, the reflection of the snack aisles seems to stretch back further than the store actually goes, creating a liminal maze of neon-colored chips and stale shadows that feels like it could swallow me whole if I turned my back for too long. The rhythm of my shift shattered when that rusted charcoal gray sedan drifted into the lot and glided to a stop at pump 4. It didn't pull in with the usual roar of an engine. It moved with a sickening, silent grace, its tires making no sound on the gravel, as if it were a ghost ship docking in a dead harbor. The headlights stayed on, two clinical, blinding white eyes that pierced through the store's interior and washed out every color until the world looked like a bleached bone. I stood behind the counter, my hand hovering near the silent alarm, waiting for a driver to emerge. Minutes bled into a strange, elastic eternity. The digital clock on the wall flickered from 3:20 to 3:25, but the car remained a silent monolith. Through the glare, I could see a silhouette in the driver's seat, a figure so perfectly, terrifyingly motionless that it didn't look human. It was just a black shape, a hole in the light, staring directly into my eyes through the safety glass. The chime of the front door was so sudden it felt like a gunshot in the stillness. I hadn't seen anyone walk up, but suddenly, a man was standing by the refrigerated drinks at the back of the store. He was wearing a heavy charcoal gray wool overcoat that should have been stifling in the 80-degree heat, and his back was turned to me. I cleared my throat, the sound feeling like sandpaper against my own ears. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the silence. He didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck, as if he were listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. "I'm looking for the time," he whispered. I pointed at the clock behind me, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It's 3:28, man. It's been 3:28 for a while." When he finally turned, my stomach dropped through the floor. His face was a map of uncanny valley wrongness. His eyes were set just an inch too high, and his mouth was a perfectly circular hole that didn't move when he spoke. He looked like a photograph that had been cut up and glued back together incorrectly. "That is the time here," he said, pointing a long, pale finger toward the sedan at pump 4. "I am looking for the time out there." I looked back at the car, and the panic finally took root. The headlights weren't steady anymore. They were flickering in a frantic, jagged rhythm like a dying strobe light. In the brief, agonizing flashes of darkness between the light, the silhouette in the car began to move with impossible speed. Flash. The figure was leaning against the driver's side window. Flash. The figure was in the back seat, its face pressed flat against the glass, showing too many teeth. Flash. The car door was wide open, and a woman in a yellow sundress was standing on the pavement, halfway to the door. Her movement was a nightmare. She didn't walk so much as glitch through the air, her limbs twitching in directions that suggested her bones had been replaced with rusted hinges. I reached for the store phone to call the owner, but the receiver gave me nothing but a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking that felt like it was drilling into my brain. Click, click, whir. Click, click, whir. By the time I realized the highway was gone, it was already too late to run. I bolted for the front door, intent on driving until I hit a sunrise. But as I reached for the handle, I saw the truth. Beyond the reach of the Midway neon sign, there was nothing. No road, no cornfields, no stars, just an absolute oily blackness that seemed to absorb the very idea of distance. The gas station was an island floating in a lightless void, and the woman in the yellow dress was standing right outside the glass. Her face was the worst part. Her features were inverted, like a Thatcher effect illusion come to life, making her look both agonizingly human and utterly alien. She didn't knock. She simply pressed her palm against the glass, and the safety glass began to ripple and melt like wax under a blowtorch. The heat radiating from her was dry and ancient, smelling of dust and dead stars. "The road only exists if someone is watching it," she said, her voice booming over the store's intercom system, "and you stopped looking." She didn't attack me. She and the man in the wool coat simply began to occupy the space, browsing the aisles with the terrifying vacant curiosity. They picked up bags of chips and turned them over and over, examining them as if they were relics of a dead civilization. The woman stood by the coffee station, watching the brown liquid drip into a pot that never got full, her head still tilted in that predatory listening posture. "The sun isn't coming up, is it?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper. The woman turned her circular mouth toward me, the blackness inside it deeper than the void outside. "It is always 3:28 here," she replied. "Someone has to keep the lights on, or the void gets hungry. And the void is very, very hungry tonight." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a name tag, my name tag, and pinned it to my shirt with a touch that felt like an ice pick to the chest. "Get back to work," she whispered. I looked out the window one last time and saw a new car pulling up to pump 4. It was my own car. I could see myself sitting in the driver's seat, staring into the store with wide, terrified eyes, wondering why the clerk was just standing there, frozen under the humming, buzzing lights of a station that shouldn't exist. The chime of the front door didn't just ring, it vibrated through my marrow, a discordant metallic shriek that signaled the end of my life as an observer and the beginning of my role as a monument. My other self, the version of me that had just pulled up in my own dented sedan, stepped through the threshold where the glass had once been. He moved with a heavy, leaden hesitation, his eyes darting frantically from the man in the wool coat to the woman in the yellow dress. But he didn't seem to truly see them. To him, they were just shadows in the periphery, the way you ignore a stain on the wall until it starts to move. He walked toward the back of the store, his footsteps sounding hollow, as if he were walking on a thin crust of ice over an infinite drop. I stood behind the counter, my fingers glued to the cold linoleum, watching him approach the refrigerated section. He grabbed a bottle of water. The label was blank, just a shimmering, oily silver, and turned toward me. As he walked down the aisle, the man in the overcoat didn't move out of his way. My double simply passed through the edge of the man's sleeve, the fabric blurring like static where they touched. When he finally reached the counter, the air between us became thick and viscous, smelling of ozone and old, wet pennies. He set the silver bottle down, and I realized with a jolt of pure, electric terror that I could see the Thatcher effect taking hold of his reflection in the plexiglass shield. His eyes looked normal at a glance, but when he blinked, the lids moved upward from the bottom, and his smile sat on his face like a piece of fruit that had been sliced and flipped. He didn't seem to notice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet that I recognized as my own, but when he opened it, it wasn't filled with cash or cards. He pulled out a small, translucent strip of film, a memory of my 10th birthday, glowing with a soft, amber light. "Is this enough?" he asked, and his voice was my voice, but it sounded like it was being played backward at half speed. I reached out, my hand moving of its own accord, and took the memory from him. The moment my skin touched the film, the memory vanished from my mind. I forgot the smell of the cake, the face of my mother, the feeling of the sun on my neck. It was just a gray, static-filled hole in my history now. The woman in the yellow dress drifted closer, her head still tilted at that predatory, snapping angle. She watched the transaction with her wide, white circle eyes, her circular mouth twitching in what might have been hunger or approval. "The price is always the same," she whispered through the store's intercom, the sound vibrating the candy bar racks until the wrappers hissed. My double didn't react to the voice. He just stared at me, his inverted features twitching. "I need to get back on the road," he said, his voice becoming more distorted, more like the sandpaper rasp of the man in the coat. "The GPS says I'm only 10 minutes away." I wanted to scream, to tell him that there was no road, that the 10 minutes was just the loop of 3:28 a.m. tightening around his throat. But my tongue felt like a piece of heavy, cold lead. I scanned the silver bottle. The register didn't beep. It let out a low, human groan. The screen didn't show a price. It just displayed the word, "Stay." He took the bottle back, but as he turned to leave, his hand didn't let go of the counter. It couldn't. His fingers were beginning to turn into the same dull, waxy plastic as the countertop, the transition creeping up his wrist like a slow-moving froth. He looked at his arms, then at me, but there was no fear in his eyes anymore, only a profound, hollow emptiness. He was becoming part of the inventory. "I think I'll stay for a bit, actually," he murmured, his voice now perfectly merging with the hum of the refrigerator. He walked away from the counter, but he didn't head for the door. He walked toward the snack aisle and began to straighten the bags of chips with obsessive mechanical precision. I looked out the window and hummed more. My car was still there, but now the driver's seat was empty. A new car was pulling into the lot. A bright red SUV I didn't recognize. The headlights cut through the void, and I saw a woman behind the wheel, checking her watch, looking confused. She was looking at the store. She was looking at me. I reached under the counter and pulled out a fresh name tag. My hands didn't shake anymore. The void wasn't just outside, it was in my lungs, in my thoughts, in the very way I perceived the light. I waited for the chime. I waited for the next piece of the world to come in and be forgotten. The red SUV sat idling at Pump 1, its headlights cutting through the front windows and casting long, dancing shadows of the man in the wool coat against the back wall. But I couldn't look at the new arrival yet. My eyes were locked on the silver bottle my double had left on the counter. It sat there, shimmering with a dull internal light that seemed to pulse in time with the 3:28 a.m. flicker of the overhead fluorescence. I reached out, my hand trembling so violently I thought I might knock it over. But the moment my skin touched the plastic, the shaking stopped. The bottle wasn't just cold. It was a vacuum of temperature, drawing the very heat out of my marrow. It had no weight at all. It felt like I was holding a handful of nothing, a pocket of air that had been tricked into having a shape. I didn't twist the cap. I didn't have to. As I stared into the translucent silver sides, the material seemed to thin, becoming as clear as a mountain spring. Inside, there was no water. There was a miniature, perfect recreation of the stretch of Highway 65. I used to drive every morning to get to my mother's house. I could see the rusted Eat at Joe's billboard, the specific dip in the asphalt where the rainwater used to pool, and the line of skeletal oak trees that marked the edge of the county line. But as I watched, a drop of black liquid, darker than the void outside, fell from the top of the bottle into the scene. Where the drop hit, the highway began to dissolve. The billboard didn't just break. It unraveled into gray threads of static. The trees didn't fall. They simply ceased to be, leaving behind white, jagged holes in the reality of the image. The woman in the yellow dress leaned over the counter, her circular mouth hovering inches from my ear. The smell of her was overwhelming now. The scent of a library that had been underwater for a century. "That is the 10 minutes he thought he had left," she whispered, her voice manifesting as a scrolling line of text on the credit card reader's small screen. He paid for the drink with a memory, but he bought it with his destination. You can't have both in the Midway, Elias. To stay here is to be full. To leave here is to be empty. I looked back into the bottle and saw my own car, the one my double had been driving, drifting off the edge of the dissolving road and into a gray mist. The tiny version of me inside the car wasn't screaming. He was just sitting there, his features already beginning to invert, his eyes moving to the top of his forehead as the Thatcher effect claimed him completely. A sharp, rhythmic rapping on the glass door snapped my head up. The woman from the red SUV was standing there, her face twisted in a mask of confusion and growing fear. She was wearing a professional blazer and a headset, likely a late-shift worker just trying to get home. But to my eyes, she looked like a ghost, thin, translucent, and dangerously fragile. She peered through the glass, her gaze passing right through the man in the wool coat, as if he were made of smoke. She saw me, though. She saw the clerk standing behind the counter with a silver bottle in his hand. She pounded on the door again, her mouth moving, but no sound came through the barrier. The Midway sign behind her flickered, and for a split second, the red of the neon turned the color of dried blood. "Don't let her in," I tried to say, but the words felt like they were being swallowed by the humming lights. The man in the overcoat turned away from the pretzel rack and began to walk toward the door, his movements jerky and distorted, like a film reel missing every third frame. He wasn't going to open the door for her. He was going to become the door. I watched in horror as his body began to flatten and spread, his wool coat stretching into a dark, textured frame, his waxy face melting into a new pane of glass that looked clearer and more inviting than the last. He was expanding the store. The void was growing, and it was using the patrons as building materials. I looked down at the silver bottle one last time. The highway was gone now. There was only a single, tiny, glowing point of light left at the bottom. The memory of my 10th birthday he had used to pay. It was a flickering amber spark of a candle on a chocolate cake. Without thinking, I unscrewed the cap and tilted the bottle back. I didn't drink it. I inhaled it. The memory rushed back into me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the heat of the candles, heard my mother's laughter, and for one glorious, agonizing second, the 3:28 a.m. on the clock ticked forward to 3:29. The humming of the lights died. The woman in the yellow dress shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on metal, as her yellow dress began to fade into a dull, lifeless gray. But the victory was a lie. The clock flickered, groaned, and snapped back to 3:28. The hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating so hard that the silver bottle in my hand shattered into 1,000 shards of frozen light. The woman from the red SUV finally pushed the door open. The chime didn't ring this time. It let out a sob. She stepped inside, shivering in the sudden, ancient cold of the store. "Thank God," she panted, clutching her chest. "I've been driving for hours. My GPS just kept looping. Can I use your phone? And I need a bottle of water. The coldest one you have." My hand moved on its own. I reached into the cooler and pulled out a fresh, shimmering silver bottle. I set it on the counter and looked at her with eyes that I knew, deep down, were no longer in the right place on my face. "That'll be one memory, ma'am," I said, my voice coming from the speakers in the ceiling. "Or your destination. Which would you like to give up first?" The woman in the blazer looked at me, and for a second, I saw the reflection of a normal world in her eyes. A world where clocks ticked forward and the air didn't taste like static and ozone. She laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that died instantly in the heavy silence of the aisles. "A memory? Is that some kind of local joke? Look, I have a 20, just give me the water." She tossed a crisp bill onto the counter, but the moment it touched the linoleum, the green ink began to bleed and swirl, turning into a cluster of dead, black moths that fluttered once and then disintegrated into ash. Her face went pale, the professional mask crumbling to reveal a raw, jagged terror. She looked at the man in the wool coat, who was now just a silhouette etched into the glass of the front door, and then at the woman in the yellow dress, whose head was now tilted so far back that she was staring at the ceiling with her inverted, white circle eyes. "What is this place?" the woman whispered, backing away toward the coffee station. "I just wanted to go home. I'm supposed to be home by 4. "Home is a destination," I said, and the words felt like they were being scraped out of my chest with a rusty spoon. "And the price of the water has gone up." I reached across the counter, my arm stretching with the sickening, rubbery fluidity that I didn't even try to control anymore. I grabbed the silver bottle and held it out to her. "Drink. If you drink, the thirst goes away, but the road goes with it. If you don't drink, you can try to walk back out into the black, but there's nothing out there but the things that haven't been looked at yet." The woman screamed and turned to run, but the store was no longer the small, cramped midway stop and shop I knew. The aisles had begun to stretch and multiply, forming a vast, liminal labyrinth of fluorescent lit linoleum, that vanished into a hazy, yellow distance. She ran past the chips, past the motor oil, past the greeting cards. But every time she turned a corner, she was right back in front of the counter, staring at the same silver bottle and my own twisted, Thatcherized face. The humming of the lights reached a deafening, bone-shaking crescendo, a frequency so high it started to shatter the glass in the refrigerator doors. The woman in the yellow dress began to vibrate in sync with the noise, her body blurring until she was nothing but a smear of vibrant, impossible color against the gray shelves. "The void is full, Elias," she shrieked through the intercom, her voice now a choir of 1,000 dying radios. "The station has enough building blocks. It's time to close the loop." I felt a sudden violent wrenching in my gut as the floor beneath the counter began to dissolve into that same oily, absolute blackness I had seen outside. The counter, the register, the racks of candy. It was all being pulled down into a central point, a singularity of forgotten things. I looked at the woman in the blazer, who was now huddled on the floor, weeping as her own features began to shift and slide, her eyes migrating toward her hairline, while her mouth widened into that terrifying perfect circle. In a final desperate act of defiance, I grabbed the heavy mag light from under the counter and swung it with everything I had at the main circuit breaker box behind me. I wanted the dark. I wanted the void to take me, if it meant I didn't have to see 3:28 a.m. one more second. The metal crunched, sparks showered over my skin like burning needles, and for a heartbeat, the humming stopped. The world plunged into a darkness so thick it felt like being buried alive in cold ash. But then, a light flickered. Not the fluorescent buzz of the store, but a single amber spark. It was the memory I had inhaled, the birthday candle. It hovered in the center of the darkness, a tiny, defiant pinprick of reality. In its glow, I saw the truth of the Midway. It wasn't a trap for travelers. It was a cocoon. We weren't being eaten. We were being processed into something that could survive what was coming when the rest of the world finally stopped looking at the road. The amber spark flared one last time and then vanished, swallowed by a new, much larger light. I opened my eyes and found myself standing outside on the gravel lot. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple and orange smear that looked more like a healing wound than a sunrise. The Midway Stop and Shop sign was gone. In its place stood a towering, windowless monolith of smooth, charcoal gray stone that seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic thrum. My car was gone. The red SUV was gone. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were no longer flesh. They were the same waxy, translucent material as the silver bottles. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I didn't have a mouth anymore, just a smooth, unbroken plane of skin. I turned toward the highway, hoping to see a car, a person, anything that proved the world still existed. But the road didn't lead to Indiana anymore. It stretched out across a flat, gray plain that was covered in thousands of identical stone monoliths, each one humming with the same 3:28 a.m. frequency. Every few miles, a single flickering neon sign stood in the wasteland, marking a new stop and shop for the things that now traveled the void. I wasn't Elias anymore. I was the inventory. I was the light. I was the reason the road stayed visible for the next poor soul who dared to drive through the dark. I looked up at the sky, where the stars were being blinked out one by unseen fingers, and I felt a cold, hollow peace settle over me. The shift was finally over. The long night had ended, but the dawn belonged to something else.